Dr. Allan Luke. Um, Allan needs little introduction, but I will still introduce him. Allan is kind of like he started all our pioneering work in critical literacies. And Allan was a third generation Chinese American. And then he graduated from Simon Fraser University with a PhD in education. So he's our alumnus, okay. and then Allan went to Australia and became a professor and then dean of education in Queensland University, and then and he did so much work there, and also in our field, especially pioneering critical literacies. He's so well respected. And personally, he's kind of like my personal mentor for so many years, right from the 1990s when I was a fresh PhD graduate, and up to now. So he's a dear, dear brother and a dear, dear mentor. I can't say how much I'm indebted to him, grateful to him. And today, we have the next generation of scholars to co-host this seminar with us. So over to you, Chung Hong.
Thank you, Angel. So in today's seminar, we will have an interview with Dr. Allan Luke. Perhaps I could just start with a question, and then if you have any follow-up questions, please go ahead. So the first question is about Allan's intellectual journey. So could you please walk us through the key milestones in your intellectual journey? What foundational experiences, mentors, and theoretical paradigms have most significantly shaped your scholarship in critical literacy? And how has your thinking about literacy and education evolved over the course of your career?
Wow, that's a big one. Thank you, Chung Hong. And thank you all, Phoebe, Angel, and others for organizing this. It's been 10 years since I've spoken publicly, actually. I very deliberately withdrew from the field, figuring that it was generationally time to pass the torch over. That's why it's great to have Angel. We've got 3 generations of scholars here, you, me, and all of our young colleagues here. And initially when this came up, I started making notes, and then yesterday I thought, should I prepare? Should I sit down and read and prepare? And then I realized that's not really what I do anymore. I'm a musician. I'm working on a stone wall out in the back with concrete later today. My life has changed in many ways. And I'm reading this book by the Israeli cultural anthropologist Harari, Yuval Noah Harari, called Nexus. And it goes over much familiar ground that we know in communications theory and language. But the interesting thing that he does is he contrasts, in some of his work, expository versus narrative text as being in his new theory of information, which I'm not sure, I'm only partway through, so I'm not sure how new it is. But as he goes through the history of the printing press, spoken language, etc., into literacies, into the digital realm, and he ends with AI, he begins talking about how information has an expository function, that is, it's referential. Information refers to things, and it can be falsified, it can be refuted, it can be argued with. But he also argues that information has a non-representational function. That is, and he refers to things like DNA, the patterns that connect things in nature, the symmetry of designs on leaves and in natural things. And he says that that's all information that's coded, but it's not representational. It's not, in an Aristotelian sense, mimetic. It doesn't purport to show any truths. It just is. And then he talks about narrative knowledge as being the things that hold cultures together. And I find, as a songwriter now, and I was speaking to my sisters online this morning about our family history and my grandparents again. I find that I'm not sure what Ericksonian stage you reach in your mid-70s, but I'm much less interested in expository knowledge now and in reading scientific stuff. I go on Medline to read medical stuff because I'm a senior citizen, you know, and I play Google Doctor on myself all the time. But really, both in my songs, I went to see the great American songwriter Jimmy Webb in concert this week, talking about the writing of Galveston and Wichita Lineman and MacArthur Park. That narrative is what matters to me. Narrative is what matters in the sense of it holds cultures together. It's basically what's fueling a lot of the conspiracy theories and a lot of the madness that goes on now. And as Harari says, it probably is as important a form of knowledge as expository knowledge. Now, I wrote this very early on, that the Hallidaean model of systemic functional linguistics really privileged in Jim Martin and Michael Halliday's book, Writing Science, and all of Halliday's work. It privileged expository knowledge. It privileged scientific knowledge. It privileged academic prose, and held up Darwin's Origin of Species as the apotheosis of print literacy, okay? Almost as if it were echoing what Thomas Spratt and the others in the 18th century would have called Royal Society prose, a one-to-one relationship between signifier and signed. So we, in schooling, especially with the push on STEM, we privilege the expository scientific knowledge, especially as we're dealing with climate change, especially as we're progressing through scientific change, climate change, and all of these other things. But what about narrative knowledge? And in my doctoral thesis at SFU, I guess it was early 1980s, that I did with Suzanne Descastel and Kieran Egan as my supervisors. And we were the first cohort, John Walsh, myself, David Wallace. We were the first cohort of students to go through SFU as a PhD, as PhD students. And we never visited UBC. We were SFU. We were Burnaby people. And I mention that again and again because nobody knew about SFU at the time. And a lot of my work and my education was not of Ivy League pedigree. I didn't go to the great universities. I didn't have famous people as mentors or any of that. It was very much working on the margins, working as a school teacher, working at the field and using your instincts. I mean, I taught at James Cook University. Who ever heard of James Cook University in the 80s? And I was teaching teacher education for 16 hours a week while I was trying to write these things. So I never had this privileged academic career. But narrative is what matters to me. And in the first studies that I did of Dick and Jane, I was influenced very strongly by work that I had done under Richard Anderson. He had come out to teach summer school, and he was a leading cultural psychologist, social psychologist working on schema theory at the University of Illinois. Dick Anderson was one of the keys in shifting reading research to comprehension in the 1980s. And I came into this meeting with Dick Anderson and studying with him with this with all the Marxism in my head, with Karl Marx, with Paulo Freire, with wanting to make revolution and fight the war in my head. And I remember Dick being the worst graduate student, because every time Dick tried to teach us cognitive theory, Ausubel, schema theory, Bartlett's models of schema, how people remember, I kept putting up my hand and saying, well, what about the revolution, Professor Anderson? You know, what about politics? What about ideology? And I remember him saying to me at one juncture, Mr. Luke, and back in the 70s and 80s, we still were called Mr. Luke and Professor Anderson. We put up our hands to speak. It was a very different university environment. And we typed our theses on typewriters. And I remember him saying to me, you'll get a chance to give a seminar at the end. In the meantime, just be quiet, you know, and listen and learn this because maybe you'll use it. And I had, from my undergraduate training, which was very influential, I studied with two great professors, one a man named Walter A. Davis, who wrote a book. I had to write it down this morning, was writing a book called, I think, Existence and Awareness or something. in 1970s, and we were copy editing his book as we went to his house every Wednesday night, and I read under him Kant's critique of pure reason, every page of Hegel's Phenomenology in the Bailey 19th century translation, all of Marx's 1844 manuscripts. I was 20 years old when I did this. All of Marx's 1849 manuscripts on alienated labor, John Dewey's Art as Experience, Martin Heidegger's Being in Nothingness, Being in Time, and Merleau-Ponty, Aristotle, and Plato. And I'm a Chinese American kid, third generation out of LA. Third generation, meaning my grandfather on my father's side was born actually in San Francisco in 1880. And on my mother's side, my grandparents were Cantonese rice and pig farmers who lived on the island of Oahu in a place called Punaluu, next to a very famous place called Sacred Falls. We visited the family farm there, and they have family reunions there. And that's the Wong family side of my family. So I grew up in the 50s, born in 1950. I grew up in that American progressive education system, reading Dick and Jane, practicing public speaking, learning how to debate, in a brilliant American system taught by my wave of minority teachers, a lot of Jewish teachers, and we were rewarded for arguing. I think it was around year 5 or 6 where I had my first Chinese American teacher, and I finally figured out then that I would do best if I thought outside of the box. Every time they gave us an assignment, I would think, what's everybody else going to do? And I would try to think iconoclastically, how do you do this differently? Now that's a very American zeitgeist. That's a very American of the 50s. And we were migrant family, first Chinese families moving out of Chinatown into our communities. There was some degree of systemic racism and all of that, but we were supported by the church, we were supported by the schools, we had great education, and we, like the rest of America, were riding on the post-war sentiment and the Bretton Woods Accords and the very economic settlement that is coming apart as we see it right now. So if Bretton Woods agreements of 1946 and all of the American post-war settlement, the Marshall Plan in Europe, the MacArthur Plan in Japan, the carving up of the world into factories and the redirection by American industry of Japanese industry, of German industry, if the settlement of America, what it did was it provided all of us, even us children of migrants and minorities in the US, an incredible economic period of growth, of development of each generation successively under what Benedict Anderson would call print nationalism or print capitalism. It was flourishing. This was before Kennedy, before Nixon. TV, the Brady Bunch hadn't even occurred yet. We were looking at Bonanza and the 1950s John Wayne type movies all the time. So it was a monoculture, educational monoculture and so forth, an assimilationist culture. But the economic growth, the opportunities were extraordinary. Now, and so it was during that period, I want you to think linguistically, I want you to just consider this for just a minute. It was during that period that the work of William Gray set up, William Gray, the first great reading researcher in the 1940s. So we have the Americans and the victor countries setting up a world order. And the world order is developed around world language English. Okay? So it's a different history than Alistair Pennycook's history of British colonialism and that spread of English. It's a resettlement around American economic expansion, American empire, American culture, and so forth, that is now being undone. But it was one in which the concept of functional literacy and human capital that literacy was about learning print to increase worker capacity, to increase the industrial workforce. So that formula of functional literacy was invented by, the term was invented by William Gray in the 1940s and 50s. Even though the US had been testing literacy all the way back to 1910 and 11, the first literacy tests were invented in 1910 and 11 for the US Army. The first ESL program that we know of was established by Henry Ford in the Dearborn, Michigan Ford factories for European migrants in the 1910s. So we find the founding of ESL as a field, the founding of functional literacy are really about the provision of human capital for industrial economies. Okay? And at the same time, what we got was another field established by William Gray and others called language planning. And that is in the 1950s. I mean, by that time, Joshua Fishman was still in high school. So Himes was Dill Himes. When I spoke to him, he was a graduate student in the 50s, taking notes at Levi Strauss's lectures. Okay, so the founders of what would come later, Fishman, Ferguson, Himes, are still graduate students. Shirley Heath is studying at Columbia in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so these people are still under Margaret Mead. So these people are still graduate students. Courtney Kasdan is teaching high school in the 1950s and is a young communist. Okay, Kenneth Goodman and Yetta Goodman are teaching high school in the 1950s, and they are blacklisted as communists. So that generation that would educate me, would become our mentors, are still in the backdrop of the 1950s. And in the 1950s, what we get is the field of language planning pushing towards language standardization in the post-war, post-colonial states. Okay, so Bahasa Malay, Bahasa Indonesian, the formalization of Cantonese, the standardization of languages, the elimination and management of vernacular languages, and the setting of national standards, the process that we still see to this day as we deal with world language English, world language French, and world language Mandarin, and world language Spanish. The move towards standardization begins in the 50s under a technocratic industrial society led by American empire. And we find that running as a monocultural theme right through the 1950s. Then, bam, my life changes, everybody's life changes. Well, what happens? Simultaneously, Kennedy beats Nixon in 1960. How does he do that? Television. So I want you to think of what we're witnessing today with tariffs, with Trump, with all of this, with the new fascism. And what we witnessed then is an artifact of this incredible convergence of political economy, the nature of work, the nature of capital. So I'm still Marxist enough to focus on that as being an economic base that begins to shift in the 1950s under American rule, American leadership very much, and British and others. Okay, so we have that. We get, at the same time, we get massive cultural shifts, economic base, cultural superstructure, and the narratives of the 1950s and 60s and 70s begin to change. So I'll use Harari here, because one point that Harari doesn't seem to like Marx, and I think he misunderstands Marx, but I think if you believed that, as Marx, that ideology was the opiate of the masses, and then you moved into ideology theory and you believed that ideologies were systematically formed ideas, systems of ideas that were promulgated amongst the masses. To quote Marx and Engels, the dominant ideas of an age are the ideas of the ruling class, and that ideology tips the world upside down in a camera obscura. But if we add to that Harari and Lyotard's understandings, what we begin to see is that ideology is not a set of ideas. It's not a scaffolded set of coherent ideas, just like social policy is. It's a bunch of stories. Ideologies are narratives. And Harari's point is, it is the narratives that create conspiracy theories. It is the narratives that mislead people. It is the narratives that elect somebody like the President of the United States. It is a shift in the narratives. And Hegel would have called these zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist I learned is when I was 19 years old, the zeitgeists were about to undergo what the dialecticians would call Aufgehoben. They're about to be canceled, negated, and uplifted in another historical moment. So you ask what my influence is. There was a question there. You asked what my influence is. It was Hegel. I was a 19-year-old Chinese American kid just trying to deal with the war in Vietnam, black nationalism, and I read Hegel. And I didn't understand any of it. I had to yellow marker every line and go back over every sentence until I realized that both Hegel and Dewey were writing dialectically. They were trying to get me. Every sentence was a thesis, antithesis, synthesis trap for the reader, and I had to read it accordingly. So with Walter Davis, I went through every word. And what I began to realize is this model of dialectics through Hegel and Marx, etc., begins to account for what happened in 1946 to 49. And 49 was a big year for China. It begins to account for what happened in that period. In any case, so we get this convergence of changes in political economy, which we have now, changes in mass culture, in cultural superstructure. And at the same time, this is what Harari and Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan and Walter Ong would tell us, changes in the dominant mode of information. So I don't agree with Gunter and them. I'm not a technological determinist. I don't believe necessarily that all media have affordances. I'm not a technological determinant, but I believe that political economy, cultural change, change in the nature of work, changes in the flows of capital, and changes in the mode of information work concurrently and dialectically through history. They weave together in this really complex dance. And throughout my life now, being the beneficiary of print capitalism, then being the beneficiary of liberal multiculturalism and the emergence of the liberal progressive state, then being the beneficiary of neoliberal capitalism and globalization, and now just being a retiree in the midst of whatever is happening now, which is as significant a moment of Aufheben, of historical cancellation, uplifting, negation, and reconfiguration. And that's what we're witnessing now. I mean, we are both terrified and fortunate enough to go through something this significant. I mean, if you read John Dewey's notes in the Child Society of 1904, you'll see they were looking at the Industrial Revolution, at the rise of millenarian religions, at the movement from the countryside to the city, at the emergence of industrial workers. G. Stanley Hall was writing about this strange creature called the adolescent in 1906. So Dewey, 1906, 1910, is looking at this industrial world of the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, and going, oh my gosh, what is happening? The medium of information has changed. The mode of information has changed. The culture has changed. The demographics have changed. The nature of labor has changed. The nature of gender relations has changed. And Dewey begins to write, we better change the educational system as well. Okay, so we're both terrified and privileged enough to be living at a moment in which all this solid is melting into air. The economic base, the cultural base, the theoretical base. I mean, I think post-humanism, as much as I know about it, is just a moment that it will be gone as this AI stuff begins to be materialized and realized in a different formation. So anyway, I want to raise that because my foundation is a Chinese American kid taught by my father, who was fully assimilated. He had a degree but couldn't use it because of the racism in the United States. I mean, my father had a bachelor's degree in journalism, 1936, from the University of Washington, that he wore like a badge of honor to be a Chinaman, to have a degree in 1936 in the United States. But he went to work as a journalist, and they made him a copy boy. And so he joined the linotyping union and became a linotyper. So he was a print man par excellence, a linotyper, a writer, you know, a failed journalist in many ways, okay? But then, and I want you to contrast this because I'm going to come back to this in relation to Trump later. Think 1960, Kennedy beats Nixon because Nixon starts sweating on camera and Kennedy looks like this incredibly handsome, articulate man. The screen is black and white in our house. There's no color TVs yet. We watch Bonanza on TV and there's Kennedy and Nixon. In 1946, when Harry Truman ran for re-election, he had to do it through radio broadcasts like FDR. And then to see the people, he had to get on the back of a train and go to city by city doing this. In 1954, when Adlai Stevenson ran for election versus Dwight Eisenhower, they did it on the radio with an occasional early television interview if they could do it. But it was all done through dominant print media, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune. So media, public opinion, cultural formation was done through print and radio. And then suddenly it was being done through TV as well. So we begin to get a change in demographics, a change in electoral politics, concomitant with a shift in what Mark Poster calls the mode of information. Okay? And when we get changes in the mode of information, the whole game changes. Okay? So let me go back just a step. So my response is, to your initial question is, Chong-Hun, is that I'm a Chinese American kid. I know nothing. If one reason why I'm against trigger warnings is, what are you going to do? Take this Chinese American kid and give him a trigger warning and say, you're about to read Karl Marx, you're 18 years old. This is going to blow your mind. It's going to make your hair stand on end. It's going to be in disagreement with everything that you were ever taught. Well, that didn't happen. And it blew my mind and it changed everything. I mean, the purpose of education is not to reinforce your culture all the time. It's to disrupt, it's to abrade, it's to push. You can't do critical literacy if everybody's on the same page. James G., in order to be critical, you must have access to multiple discourses. If I'm a Chinese American kid and I get only culturally appropriate pedagogy that says, tell us about being Chinese American, let's deconstruct that, let's talk about your home language, your stocks of community knowledge, nobody would have taught me Marx. Okay, nobody would have taken my house and shaken it and thrown it all over again and then said, how do you remake that? So my other professor as an undergraduate was a man named Hugh Kenner, who wrote The Pound Era. He was the great scholar of Ezra Pound, and he introduced me to the work of Walter Ong. And this was way back when and Ong began to, and in Kenner's own work, I studied Ezra Pound, Gustave Flaubert, and Jonathan Swift with him. And reading Jonathan Swift totally blew my mind. Political, satiric, ironic. You could not read Swift's Modest Proposal, which is an attack by an Irishman on the English Empire. If you had a trigger warning, it wouldn't work because it was so shocking. Okay. So for a lot of text to work, you can't give people trigger warnings because the text is meant to blindside them, to hit them across the head with a 2x4. And the Modest Proposal, Swift's work, was to do that. So Kenner, who had worked with Ong and Guy Davenport, was part of a conservative Catholic scholarly group coming out of Toronto, who had also connected, and we read, and Hugh Kenner encouraged me at the time to read Marshall McLuhan, even when he was a popular culture figure. So even as an undergraduate, 19 years old, I read Marshall McLuhan about the medium is the massage, and this is about the bias of communication. So all of the work about affordances of media, multiliteracies, is there in McLuhan and Harold Innis. That's why I asked you to read about Innis. 1949, brilliant. He had studied at University of Chicago, and Innis was, there he went. It was Empire and Communications was his book. And it was about how rivers, canoes, portaging, the telephone, the telegraph were communications media. Rivers were communications media. Cultures interchanged around the Mekong, around the Mississippi, around the Nile River, okay, because they were the modes of communication. Then it became telegraphs, telephones, and TVs. Okay, so what we have, so coming out of this as an undergrad, I still knew nothing about the world. I was 22, I was a leftist, I had an undergraduate degree, I was confused, I was a hippie, I played the guitar, I was, was smoking a lot of dope at the time, slightly out of control. So I moved to Seattle, not knowing where I was doing, and I went to work in a library, and I didn't know what was going to, but Seattle was my grandfather's hometown. So I had to go somewhere to get out of California, and I moved to Seattle. And when I was in Seattle, I applied to Simon Fraser University to study Marxist theories of literature as a graduate student. And I got a letter from Simon Fraser saying, come and join us, okay? And I got a graduate scholarship, and in '73, I moved to Canada. So the most important thing I did in my life to come back, and again, I had my head packed with Hegel, with Marx, with Flaubert, with James Joyce, with everything I could, okay? And I still knew nothing. I had never been out of the United States. I was an American.
You're right. I realized that okay, let me summarize, because it's so rich a history, and it's so instructive for the next generation. I need to unpack it a little bit for them. I know that I think what I've got from your narrative is the importance of looking at the larger political economic context, and we understand, and also the technological radical changes, from the print, radio to TV to now the social media to X, and then this communication technology, Macron, right, Canadian, okay, we are Canadians, okay, and we are Chinese Canadians, okay. The Marshall McLuhan is the medium, is the message. So we understand the mode of information, technological change, AI, disruptive technology of AI, and the disruptive communication technology of social media, mobile social media, totally changed the landscape of how politicians propagate their narratives. And in this one perspective, we need to look at the larger technological change, political economy, understand what's happening, the demographic change, okay, so from your narrative. And we also need to look back at our academia, that people are siloed, compartmentalized within their disciplines, especially the next generation I've been working with. They know nothing about communications, technology, social media. They just work on if they work on systemic functional or CDA or whatever, they just have a narrow, it's by no fault of theirs, it's the academia, which is compartmentalizing. And then the idea from Yuval Harari, I'm also following him, the myth of, we live by metaphors, okay? We live by narratives. And we live by stories, okay? So you have many myths. The myths of the nation, the myth of the standard language, the myth of language itself, that Tsinghua, our next generation is here working with Professor Paul Thibault, working on the myth of language itself, the ecological languaging perspective, and then ecological psychology, evolutionary biology, these insights from people outside of our linguistics discipline will help us to understand the blind spots, the myth, the story of one standard language, the story of having language with boundaries, right? So what I've learned from your narrative, Allan, is so rich. I try to summarize it, that we need to look at the broader ecology of our world now, the changing political economic landscape, the changing technological landscape, the changing social media landscape. So all these also come back to looking at our academia, which is so siloed, so compartmentalized. Our next generation is so ill-served because they are asked to just focus on one tiny little discipline, so that we are ontologically blind, we are epistemologically blind, so that they think what they have learned, say for example, those assessment scholars in assessment, just know that significance testing is the only epistemology.
We become prisoners of paradigms. We're paradigmatic.
Exactly, that's so good, so well put.
And our training does
the next generation of scholars, students, grad students, we imprison them basically.
Yes.
In our academic discipline. Now we need to liberate, the Liberation Day, for our.
I think that's why the loss of broad-based liberal arts education, and indeed of broad-based Confucian education, but a broad-based education it narrows the field, because both my work and my colleague and partner Carmen Luke's work, we would have never been able to do this work if we had, remember I said I had a very poor pedigree. You know, I don't have Harvard, Yale, Stanford, any of that stuff behind me. I went to University of California, Santa Barbara, and Simon Fraser. But what happens is, if you don't have the cross-disciplinary, multi-paradigmatic models, and you aren't in some way a disruptive thinker,
you're going to be blind, basically.
You're going to reproduce whatever the field tells you to reproduce.
Exactly, whatever the disciplinary paradigms telling us, significance testing, positivism. Okay.
The other thing is, you see, neither Carmen nor I ever had any supervisor mentors to tell us what we could not write. Because we were writing at Simon Fraser, at James Cook, and the world was not watching, and we were fortunate enough to have people like Kieran Egan and Suzanne de Castell and others who just said, go for it, do what you do.
That's why the next generation is so important.
Yeah.
Alan, your mentors, and then you are my mentor. And then we become mentors to these young, brilliant scholars. I'm trying to give them all these multiple perspectives, James G's critical multiple discourses, multiple perspectives, so that we are not ontologically blind, epistemologically blind. And so that even though we are being marginalized right now, we know who we are, okay? We know who we are. Even though conferences, journals, they might marginalize our epistemologies.
Well, you see, I think that's where it becomes political. There's the old cliche, the personal is political and the political personal, is that how do you ground all this big theory and all of this? Well, one way, obviously, for us is that it's a blessing to be in the field of education, because there's only so much bull that we can peddle before it gets tested by somebody in a classroom or taken seriously.
Exactly, we have the reality check.
And that's a reality test. I mean, one of the things that I found frustrating being around English departments and cultural studies is they spent all their time trying to justify themselves as fields. In education, we don't need to justify ourselves as a field, because we got kids and we've got huge institutions.
Yeah, we need teachers. Education is a field, right? Now, I want to connect your rich life stories to Qinghua's work, and then later I will connect your life story to each of our next generation scholars' work. Now, Qinghua has been working with narrative analysis. You know, this methodology is marginalized by journals, by conferences, right? But Qinghua has been working so persistently. Qinghua, would you tell the story? Now, because the CDA, critical discourse analysis, is so representational, okay? It marginalized narrative stories.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Also, let me add this. The Hallidayan linguistics, when it gets to the level of textual macro proposition, it comes apart. It's very, very brilliant at the level of the clause and the sentence, okay? And through Ruqaiya Hassan's cohesion model, it's great at the level of how these things fit together. But if you approach it going all the way back to Crescent Hodge's languages ideology, as soon as it gets to the level of macro propositional structure of narrative and exposition, it's not as astute. And for me, I mentioned this just before you go on, Jim, Dick Anderson, in the Dick and Jane book, Literacy Textbooks and Ideology, that my doctoral thesis which was published in 1988, what I did was I took Marxist theories of ideology and I took story grammar models from Meyer, Kinch, Rummelhart that had been developed by Tuin van Dijk, that had been developed by cognitive psychologists, and I put them together to say that stories are ideologies. That is, they are what Kenneth Burke might call, they are grammars of motive and grammars of human action.
Yes.
We could study grammars, we could study stories that way. And I actually think that part of my work, you asked this as one of the sub questions, that part of my work really didn't get taken seriously enough.
Right, we should take up that part of your work seriously.
Describe what you're doing with narrative, Qinghua.
Yeah. Narrative, critical narrative analysis, Qinghua.
Yes, and actually what I've done is to counter the negative impact of language ideologies in Hong Kong through ways of creating designed narratives that aims at simulating certain experiences for pre-service teachers who might not have the experience of being discriminated against on linguistic basis. So basically what I've done was created stories that would able to, like, I would say, simulate and let our pre-service teacher to have the experience, have at least the partial experience of stepping in the shoes of the others in the Hong Kong society who might be discriminated against due to their language issues. Like, for example, they do not speak English according to the so-called native speakerism standard, or people who are learning Cantonese and speak non-standard Cantonese in Hong Kong. So to a lot of the pre-service teachers in Hong Kong, they may be, because they grow up spoken Cantonese, they might not have the experience of being on the other side. They may not have the resources to help them to really resourcefully experience what other people, the minorities in Hong Kong or the newcomers in Hong Kong might have experienced within the society. So by creating stories that simulate this kind of experiences and have discussions with them in class about these stories, this study looks at ways of creating like a critical experiential learning experiences for the pre-service teachers. So that's what I've done in the Hong Kong context.
Why did you choose invented narratives as opposed to available narratives from community?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. So the created narratives are actually composited stories from the real narratives. So, my logic, the logic behind is, okay, we can share our everyday experiences and we can share our stories. But, sometimes for one person's story, one person's experience, they may not be, I would say, may not be as telling. Containing a lot of the insightful experiences and ideas. So the design narratives are actually composited stories that we've learned in other fields, in other narrative analysis studies, or in other studies about language.
Ethnographic.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
It's interesting. I know very little about the social psychology around this. In fact, I was listening to Jonathan Haidt last night, who's written the Anxious Generation or something like that. I know very little about the literature on empathy, but I certainly know that in reader response theory and some of the other literary theories, that was one of the key functions of literature, is almost an affective empathy.
Yes. And there is a good ending to this story for Qinghua. It has taken him 2 years and 12 reviewers and how many rounds of revision, but he's got it just accepted for publication in Applied Linguistics, the top journal. So the next generation, don't give up, and just our methodology can be sometimes marginalized, like narrative analysis. We are not doing experimental significance testing. Okay.
That's right. And I think you need to know that both Angel and I had trouble getting our work published early on. And Angel had the stuff she was doing under James Heap as her doctoral work that was driving down the conversational analysis field. That was straightforward because there was a field, there was an audience for conversational analysis. But as soon as Angel, in her own history and life, the work began to take different contours, and Angel and I are both eclectic, working across different kinds of linguistics, different kinds of sociologies. As soon as that began, it became progressively more difficult. And initially, all the work on critical literacy that I did, some with Suzanne de Castel and much on my own, I could not get published. The reading research community thought that I didn't have any experimental t-tests, and I didn't have any psychological theory. And what's all this talk about ideology? I remember giving papers on language and literacy and power at AERAs, and our elders walking the back of the room when they were there and shaking their heads. Some who now are well on board about talking about power, but saying, you can't talk about power. What's the stuff about power? What's the stuff about politics? It's just about decoding a language position.
So Allan's narrative will be very good encouragement to Tsinghua. Keep on doing what you think is the critical narrative inquiry as a methodology. Okay.
Yes.
Now I want to move the speaking turn to Chonghong. Chonghong, your study again, it is so much against the grain because you're interviewing your PhD studies to interview graduate students who are trying to publish in our field. And you're focusing on the affective aspect, the emotional well-being, the stress. So would you say a little bit about how Allan's narrative would have helped you or would have influenced your work right now? And also our work, we are having a special issue on trauma-informed care in TESOL. This is Chonghong is spearheading this new work. So can Chonghong talk about that?
Okay, thank you, Angel. So I think one part of my research that is related to Allan's work is our understanding of knowledge and reality. So in my doctoral thesis, instead of just focusing on how doctoral students, they could succeed in terms of publication, I want to explore how they might feel they are excluded because they don't have publications, or they feel that their publications are not some kind of social capital that they could utilize to have access to elite universities or to some faculty positions. So in my study, I used the perspective of affect to see how they internalize these kind of feelings like they are rejected by the academia. Because sometimes it's not about they cannot write, it's about how they perceive themselves in the global academic community. Like some participants mentioned that the reviewer directly mentioned that the students need to reduce their use of Chinese theories or the Chinese context because they feel this kind of narrative might not fit the global scholarship or readership. And I feel like this kind of comments are quite traumatic. And this group of students, actually, they feel like they cannot do anything to deal with this kind of issue because they are just students and they submit their articles to be evaluated by the so-called gatekeepers or senior researchers. So they feel they are powerless and they cannot do anything, and they internalize this kind of trauma. And whenever they submit their articles to international journals, they feel like they know that their articles could be rejected. And they even don't want to think about the reason behind this phenomenon. It's like they feel like they are Chinese and they deserve this rejection. And I think these kind of stories are quite depressing and also traumatic for international students. So that's why Andrew and I, we together with Sandra Dovchin from Korean University, we are organizing a special issue on linguistic racism and trauma in TESOL.
Well, that's what it is. It's a convergence of two things. Sounds like it's very powerful work, and congratulations to you on it. But it's a convergence of two things. Raymond Williams often talked about residual and emergent traditions, and that we're caught up in the backlash of what is, first of all, a residual tradition of neoliberalism, in which everything is about numerical performance. And it's a return to positivism that is wiping out a lot of multidisciplinary and humanistic and qualitative and critical research. So the impact of neoliberalism and the corporatization of the universities is a pretty powerful force. And across 20 or 30 years, I've been both a participant of it. At times, I was even an advocate of it. And now I can see the absolute destruction of these universities as principled. Look at the capitulation to American censorship of the major universities in the last week. And the fact is, I mean, here's the interesting thing about neoliberalism. When Angel and I were first in contact and working, and I was at James Cook and University of Queensland in the 1980s, the coming of neoliberalism, that is the idea that how much you published, where you published, counting these things we actually welcome these things. Why? Because there were no good old days. The universities were very much locked up in what I'd call a good old boys domination by, I'll put it bluntly, by white male senior professors who dominated the fields, controlled the promotions. And if you were a person of color, an overseas student, an outsider, an African American, a woman, or a queer person coming up through the system, you were going to have to fight like hell to get through that system because of the structural racism built into the old university. So as much as I've been...
It is still there. It is still there.
Still there. I'm sure it's still there. Okay. So when the idea of metrics came in, a lot of us jumped for joy because we had portfolios and we could say, you know, that person who's beneficiary of this kind of racist patriarchy, I've outperformed them. I've published more, I've done more than them. And we actually had a case. So certainly in Australia, at one point, there were only 4 or 5 of us, non-whites in Australian education faculties. And I was the first senior dean. And what happened is, under neoliberalism, we had our performance stats and we were able to move women, people of color, into positions of power. Okay?
Yes,
so
yes.
the first blush of neoliberalism was actually beneficial to women and to people of color.
I could see it in every kind of ideology or ism. There can be spaces that we can carve out. Agentic, it's never one totalistic. Yeah, I like to turn the focus to Bongi, and then later to Phoebe, later to Xiaoqing, later to Tracy. Okay, to talk about how Allan's work would inspire you or would support what you're doing now.
Actually, I was quite intrigued by your critique of systemic functional linguistics because I have been quite influenced by systemic functional linguistics, especially when I'm teaching first-year university students. And it gives me, because it allows me to move away from Chomskyan approach to language, and then looking at the language as function and has particular social purposes, and then in order to achieve the particular social purposes, we have to use a specific code, a specific order of information, and specific rhetorical. We have to be aware of what kind of rhetorical movement that we need to use. So I have incorporated this idea quite heavily in my class because I was born and raised in Korea, and I never had academic training in North America until I moved to, I started my master's. And my first paper was not even graded, and it was written, it was sloppy, revise, resubmit, and etc. So I did not even know the word sloppy, so I have to look up the word in the Korean English dictionary to find that what that means. It was a shock because at that time, I was very proud of myself that I wrote in English for 7 pages long, which was beyond TOEFL exam. But this incident really made me to really pay attention to the field of critical second language writing. And I wanted to know more about this area. And at the time when I was starting my master's, you and Angel were the rising stars, and then really pushing away from the cognitive SLA to social SLA. And it was at that time, and everyone was talking about why do we need this, why do we need that. So I was in the midst of that that time, and then when many of the in that era, the critical second language writing was mostly focusing on the voice of the writer, and we need to embrace bilingualism and different ways of doing things and different ways of thinking, and then writing in two different texts or languages are needs to be valued, and so I had this idea from that class, taking those classes, and I was excited that I could apply that, and I wasn't. It was not very successful. People were like, "Well, I can see that you can speak English, but I don't understand what you're writing about." And I was devastated. I felt lost, and I did not know what to do about it. I gave my best shot. I asked for help from many people and my friends and colleagues and professors, but I still don't, I could understand. But when I get exposed to Michael Halliday, it was like
Yes.
from the heaven.
I think Alan wasn't critiquing Halliday on that. I mean, there's a lot of good from the.
I've had an experience. Halliday's changed my fundamental.
So everything is double-edged. So that. But
let me go back.
Yeah.
The part of the problem with the Freirean model, with critical pedagogy, as it was proliferating in the U.S., is I was a school teacher. I knew this wouldn't work. And second of all, I was a minority kid who had come through the American system. I also had the notion that just working on my own community knowledge and culture was not what I was there for all the time. So what the Hallidayans gave me was a sense of the importance of explicit instruction, the importance of knowledge of grammar, and ways in which we could teach right down to the level of grammatical proficiency and competence, and even functional decoding and reading, that needed to be there in order to actually do any kind of critical work. So by adding the CDA component, which Michael and Rukaya and Terry Threadgold and Gunter had introduced to me in Australia, just fortuitously being here in Australia, by adding that component to the American critical Freirean tradition, we got beyond this progressivism that is both a strength and a limit to American education. Okay? And because child-centered, progressivist, know your community, every child, etc., deal with community knowledge, etc., is fine as a redress to chalk and talk and direct instruction. But if that's all you do, pedagogically, you're in trouble. And all the work that I did in Singapore and the work that I did in Queensland at school reform was to quit pushing a mono pedagogy, whether it's critical or explicit or didactic. And what I learned in Singapore, and what all of you would know, having been educated Chinese, is there is a place for explicit didactic pedagogy.
Right.
So that it isn't the whole game.
Yeah.
And there's a place for child-centered and a place for critical pedagogy. But we need to sit together.
Exactly.
An educational system.
The kind of critical tension of multiple discourses that James Poggi talks about, and Bakhtinian, right? But Bongi, tell me one thing that you are working on, and then that could get inspired and informed by Allan's life work?
So I had one thing that I had was I was writing a manuscript with Pedro, and then we were talking about our daily struggles, and then how how our traumatic experiences transform into our pedagogy and instructions and assessment. And then I come to realize that although holidays idea really helped me to be more explicit about the hidden unspoken rules and expectation, I start to notice that I am conforming to the white listening subject, who were the university accreditation bodies or other professors or the department expectations. And then what if they graduate from their work, we are still conformed to this monolingual, very much rigid form, and I am promoting this. I am through holiday and lens. So I start to realize that Hilary Zhang's access paradox is not very easy to apply in real life context. Whether to the degree that I wanted to change my curriculum and then informed by different kinds of theories and with a goodwill, what are the ultimate goals? Like how do I even not being able to reproduce and not as like not helping, but still students have their critical agency while still be able to access to the dominant discourse. And
that's the trick. That's the trick.
I found it's way more difficult than actually when I first encountered that literature. So I wanted to hear more of.
Well, I think there are two responses immediately. First of all, in 1980, Chris Gutierrez and I met, and we were the only non-whites in the seminars and in the rooms. I would go to seminars at UBC with Dorothy Smith and others, and it was an all-white audience. Okay, and this was as late as 1980s. So I think the first thing is that you have to trust your own alterity. That is the very thing that Chung Hong is describing. Your otherness is that Dubois double consciousness. You're not being, I mean, I think I've put this in writing, so it isn't going to be that polemical, but if you were white, privileged, male in a dominant institution, I feel bad for you, because epistemically, you're
blind. You're blind.
You're blind.
Basically
okay?
blind.
But so the first thing you got to experience, Kumpongji, and this is, I think, what Chung Hong's informants are telling him, your alterity never goes away. You know, I would say and I remember white scholars saying to me, well, isn't it hard being a minority or et cetera, being multiple subjectivities and doing this? And I said, no, it isn't, because I get up in this body every day. And then they would say, I remember saying to me, one of the famous linguists telling me, oh, you're playing the race card. And I said, well, this doesn't seem to go away. You know, so your alterity is always there. You are always going to be an outsider within the institution, and that's cool. As soon as but by the same token, as Chris did with working with Ellie Oakes and Bambi Shefflin and others, and I had to do, I didn't come up as a minority scholar. I had to get published before they ever saw my face. And I remember going to conferences and thinking, and being condescended to or spoken down to, or even called boy at some points. And I remember thinking, yeah, okay, I responded very much in a Chinese American way, not in another cultural way. I remember, I'm going to show you, you're going to meet me in print someday. And so I guess this was the ethos of migrant Chinese culture. You're going to have to, and my father and mother just saying, you're going to have to work twice as hard, mate. So your response has to be, first of all, celebrate your alterity. The second thing that we've learned from feminist post-structuralists and post-colonialists and queer theory as well, what we learn from those people is that standpoint epistemology matters.
Yes.
And so within your thesis now, we have the necessity of stating where you're coming from, how this intersects with your biographical and cultural journey and pathway, and how that necessarily informs what you're doing. Okay? So in that way, even as you are mastering the canonical form of the thesis, as you are getting your cultural capital and your credentials up and go, you maintain your heart, you maintain your soul, you maintain your integrity through the self-reflexivity of your writing. Okay? So
Yes.
to this day, you know, people talk about feeling like a fraud in the white institution, in patriarchal institutions, in heterosexual institutions. Well, I still always feel like a fraud, and it's cool. I want to feel that way. I don't want to feel comfortable in my skin as if the privilege of being emeritus professor, Mr. Heavily published, as if it is natural.
Heavily published.
It isn't, you know, all of that stuff. So what I'm saying to you both is the alterity that you're experiencing and that your subjects are experiencing is to be celebrated. And
it makes us a better person.
It gives you epistemic, moral, and almost a spiritual advantage over those who live within their culture. And this applies to China too. I mean, what I learned in Singapore was wonderful to me because living in a Han Chinese dominated society taught me more about racism than living in a white society.
Yes, yes.
Because suddenly I was in the majority and I could hear and listen to how the majority treated the white minorities and the Hakka and the colored minorities and Muslims and others. And I thought, oh, this is really insightful. This must be what white people do towards us, which I've never had access to.
But okay, I understand, Bongi, it's easier said than done. I understand the feeling-wise is so heavy. Yeah, I understand the emotional labor you've been working with, under. Yeah, it's not easy. And in the middle of it, especially, it's not easy. You feel so much marginalized and then so complicit in what you don't believe. But you still need to perpetuate all the policies of socializing students into all these academic writing.
And it's going to get harder in all of our countries now with this new fascism and right-wing censorship. It's going to get even harder.
It's actually the redeeming merit is Canada is still not America.
Yes.
I mean, that's the bottom line. Because
I was going to say, you asked for the biggest influences. The most important thing that I ever did in my life was leaving the United States. As a scholar and as a thinker and probably as a person, having the courage to do that. You know.
But Boogie, you're right. The access paradox, I mean the critical pragmatic, it's easier said than done. Okay, and we navigate. Allan, myself, and you and us have been navigating this narrow line. We have to do collusion with resistance, resistance with collusion. We cannot do 100% resistance because our livelihood is on the line. Our students' livelihood is on the line. We cannot sacrifice our students and ourselves, right? So we still need to be in the game, still need to stay not co-opted. And Qinghua and I always use this zombie metaphor. Once you got bitten by a zombie, you become a zombie. But you cannot leave the field. The field is full of zombies, the neoliberal zombies. And then how can we stay in the field and not be co-opted by the field, not becoming a zombie who only knows how to publish or how to follow the policies to survive? So how to walk a thin line between collusion and resistance? Yes. So,
the other thing that just needs to be said explicitly is all of us who are outsiders to these institutions, it brings with it huge mental health risk and problems and issues. Exactly. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years working with indigenous scholars, academics, and writers and students, and it comes with the territory. Okay.
I want to turn to Xiaoqing and Tracy first, because just last night we were having this wonderful meeting precisely about what Bongi was talking about. We need to follow institutions, senior management's policy to impose an IELTS exit test to our university. They just passed this policy. Students need to pass IELTS 6.0. Otherwise, they cannot graduate. And then And I keep saying, don't think of senior management as as being opposed to us. They are also under pressure. They are also under other larger political, economic
That's
pressure.
right.
Yeah, we need to work with them. So Xiaoqing and Tracy, we are working with them how to help students to pass their IELTS in a more humane, humanistic way, by using Bayesian statistics, by using. So maybe Xiaoqing can talk a little bit what our project, what we are doing, and your project, your PhD project, humanizing the IELTS, and using dynamic AI.
Yeah. So hi everyone. So my current project is about the complexities and tensions that teacher might face when implementing dynamic assessment, adaptive assessment in the classroom. So and I feel like because I feel like Professor Allen's work also emphasized the importance of engaging with challenging and also the conflict ideas, which also I feel like this, especially those that disrupt our epistemological perspectives and the cultural values. So I feel like both my current study and also the readings of Professor Allen's, but they highlighted the necessities of confronting developing critical thinking skills and fostering deeper understandings. So, and when it connect with my current study, I feel like it's very important and also inspiring to examine like how teachers navigate the code and sometimes conflicting demands of students. So yeah, by focusing on the challenges that teacher encounter and also the potential for both the critical literacy and dynamic assessment and adaptive assessment to help resolve these tensions.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That would be the straightforward. I think that sounds like a really, really smart way to approach it, which is if you're given the parallel that I can think of is when I was teaching high school in British Columbia in the Okanagan Valley, we were assigned on the spot. We were told there's a province-wide composition test that every one of you must take at year 12. You must get this score in order to go there and there, and it came out of the blue. And it was most of us in the BC Teachers Union and others opposed it, but we had to teach to it. The first thing that I did then, which it sounds like you're doing, is to problematicize in a Freirean sense the assessment, is to say, who is the audience of this assessment? What's the political economy behind this assessment? What are the motivations and limits of this assessment? And then turn around and you can challenge the kids and the students. I did in high school, but you can do it with your university colleagues there and say, how are we going to crack this? How are we going to beat this? That's in your interests, but fully has a meta awareness of the limits of the assessment and the uses of the assessment. Okay, I think the problem with conventional psychometrics and conventional assessments is it assumes that the assessment has either a psychometric validity and even an ontological and political institutional validity, which often it doesn't.
Exactly. I think Tracy, Xiaoqing, Qinghua, our team is reading Bayesian statistics, which is the antidote to these frequentist psychometrics statistics, and we understand how many assumptions they are operating with, which are not met.
Exactly. I
And
think
then, yeah.
working with my colleague Kim Ko in Singapore and in Calgary, she taught me a lot about IRT, about assessment about
Item response theory. We are reading it now.
hierarchy, and I had to do it because I'm a late bloomer with stats. In Singapore, I had to learn a lot about assessment from Peter and Freebody.
We are
and others.
doing it now. Yeah.
And
our team.
I think the thing to do is this. What I found is this. I never wrote it up because I never considered it expert enough. But there, in our assessment courses, we learn about content validity, face validity, different forms of validity that are
Typological validity, consequential validity.
Okay, well, let's theorize validity. What about ontological validity? I'll tell you what ontological validity asks. Basically, is what this is testing really exist?
The construct doesn't exist.
Ontological.
Metrics people say it doesn't matter. They say it doesn't matter in the textbook. It doesn't matter whether the construct exists or not, as long as it has predictive power.
Yeah, we know that I can test a whole bunch of things. I can put together a whole bunch of items and then claim that the domain in the construct is X, but necessarily it doesn't follow. So there's a question of ontological validity. There's also a question of epistemic validity.
Yeah.
And in the work that we did around
epistemic validity, because they assume that a student can take the test an infinite number of times, but that's epistemologically
and simple of cultural validity. So I mean, to give you an example, I mean, in IRT, they will eliminate every item that actually shows some degree of cultural bias. Well, if you eliminate every item that shows some degree of torqued demographic response by indigenous people or migrants or women or men, what you're doing is you're flattening out what your assessment to eliminate diversity again.
Yes, but the psychometrics, as you said, Allan, is a very closed, compartmentalized regime. They control the references, the conferences, the journals, and so on. But they are the residual tradition, and we have the emergent tradition, because Bayesian statistics precisely is what machine learning is using, what AI engineers is learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, let me change let me give the speaking turn to Tracy. Now, Tracy, you just sent me your manuscript, and I'm very, I think it has lots of potential, but tell me your feelings.
Thank you so much, Professor Lin, and thank you so much, Professor Luke. It's finally so good to meet you, not in person, so to speak, but live. Because when I was studying at the University of Toronto at OISE, I also took a course, critical literacy, with Professor Rob Simon, and we read a lot of your articles. It's just so intellectually stimulating, and also your talk just reminded me of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher, of his theory in from the pedagogy to the oppressed, and also as well as the banking model of education. And the whole thing just made me think that the education itself is politics. And all of the things that we're doing here centers around the white supremacy and native speakerism, and what the whole educational system is doing is to serve the white empire, is to position us and to sell us, to define us at every instance. And so I really like your work personally, and also about the post-truth world, the work you did with Professor Hilary Jenks, and also Freebody. And yeah, it's so good to meet you in person.
Thank you, Tracy. So your work, Tracy, what are you doing?
Oh yeah, yes, I just submitted a manuscript to the Journal of Education, Identity and Language, but then got rejected. And my title is Critical Language Awareness and Through a Translanguaging Lens. And so in that work, I basically connect CLA, the critical language awareness, to translanguaging, because I see the potential in translanguaging to improve or to enhance students' critical language awareness, just because it promotes equity, inclusion.
Oh, you have frozen, Tracy. Tracy, you have frozen. You have frozen. You're frozen, but it's okay. I think
I hear the point, and I think it's quite ironic that most of the critical language awareness work, going back to Norman Norman and Hillary and Catherine Wallace and all of that in the late 80s, was operating in a monolingual.
Sorry, my connection.
Go on, Tracy.
Yes, because I see the potential in critical language awareness to, in translanguaging to promote equity and inclusion in the classroom. So that's why I connect CLA to translanguaging. And I see a potential in your framework because you promote, to rewrite students' words and worlds. And so I think it's important to connect students' lived experience in the classroom. So then it's important to allow their use of their heritage languages and their other full linguistic repertoires. And
well, I think, we can just move right into Olive Garcia and even back to Jim Cummins' work and just make the simple, and it can be an empirical claim now, that these multilingual environments in translanguaging, participants must have a higher degree of metalinguistic awareness than in monolingual environments. That seems to me to be almost a self-evident claim. Yes. But I'm sure that we can empirically show that, and that certainly was the focus of Cummins' work for all those years. Yes. So I think that, yes, there's absolute validity in it, and if that article was rejected, send it to me. Let me have a look at it.
Thank you so much for
reading where it's at.
Okay,
because it sounds like a good one,
It's jackpot for you, Tracy. Okay, you hit the jackpot. Okay, let's change the focus to Phoebe. Thank you, Phoebe. Just talk about how Allan's work might inform you or inspire what you're doing and what your current projects are, your current struggles. Again, Phoebe works with tons of teaching load. So physically tired, emotionally drained, and still struggling to do her research. And congratulations, Phoebe, you Dr. Sue now. She just got her PhD.
Wow, congratulations. Yes.
Thank you. So actually very happy to meet you all today. And I have two aspects of project that may be mapped with your interest and your inspiration to us. The first one is because you mentioned about critical narrative analysis, but for me, because for my project, I would like to do something as a teacher to empower my students to tell their stories without being framed ideologically or being challenged very critically just based on linguistics aspect. Because a lot of the students taking my course now, I'm teaching around 30 students this semester from mainland China. They are from different regions. They travel to Hong Kong. They want to get their bachelor degree, and they are in the self-finance institute. That's why they want to use their own saving money, investment to provide better future for themselves and their kids and their family. So in my course, I try to use digital storytelling as a way that we can let students feel respected to create their own story. It's not just about modeling from some prototypes or the way that people think that, oh, if I speak like this way with this accent, with my English delivery, or I use better vocabulary, or even I may use an AI narrator, then I will get higher marks because it's a university EMI course or something like that. That's the aspect that I think I'm trying to learn from the way that people talk about how different voices or physical embodiment may be respect more critically. But I didn't add a lot of theories to guide my student. I usually just use some basic like Joe Lambert's theory about digital storytelling, narrative structures and elements, and why the 7 elements like pacing, music, everything like your physical body would be critical or important to your storytelling. And I'm thinking about after being more mature in handling the storytelling process and pedagogy with my student, I want to build up an archive for my student like human libraries, human story libraries. And I learned from this kind of project or model from some human rights museum, because we all want to respect people by listening to them rather than instructing them what to do, what to tell always. And I'm not sure if you may inspire me further as well, because you are like to me, like a scholar with a lot of wisdom. And I don't know how to get funding to start this project, if it's for cross-border students or something like that, because it's just in my mind when I'm working daily with them. I want to really capture some research project funding and maybe digitalize the human libraries as well, so that it will be more internationally circulated, like your music. Yeah.
That sounds fascinating. I think in fact, most of us, I remember when I was teaching in Burnaby, my first time as teaching ESL, it was Vietnamese migrant kids. Following Frere, I started with narrative. Okay, so I think a lot of us in our second language teaching of all different ages, we started with narrative because what's in the heart and what's in the experience actually is most easily accessible for both spoken language and writing. Now, it seems you're going in two different directions. First of all, there's a huge amount of work, as you would know, in multimodal storytelling, in digital storytelling, et cetera, particularly amongst marginalized communities, et cetera, because it's about recovering cultural memory. It's about getting voice, the politics of voice, and all of those things. So certainly that the multimodal and the multiliterate stuff is fascinating, and the questions of embodiment are ones I think which are unresolved. I mean, I think it was 91, I published the paper, The Body Literate, and it was one of the first pieces on literacy learning as an embodied practice, how to hold your body, how to do your face. In fact, Harari talks about it in Nexus a little bit in communications theory about the concept of interface between faces and the degree to which personal responsibility in face-to-face communication, et cetera, depends upon embodied facial gestures and responsibility. Think about that old expression. If you have something to say to me, say it to my face. Because that comes with an interpersonal and interactional responsibility and a whole set of ethical. But I think the question for your work, which is interesting and might be a whole research topic in itself, is the ethical and moral responsibility that you have as a teacher and as a teacher educator, soliciting people's stories, what you do with people's stories, what you teach them to do with people's stories, how you broadcast them or withhold them, or is absolutely crucial. It's an ethical question. And I felt that very much. I wrote one piece about it in one of those two collections in the last, about the biggest mistake that I made as a second language teacher was getting these Vietnamese kids to tell their stories about very hard journeys, about refugee camps, about boats, about growing up in Vietnam, et cetera, and getting to Canada. And this was in the 70s. I had them all tell their stories. Then we read them to each other. We started to publish them, write them out by longhand. And I was just almost egocentrically critical. It was that critical pedagogy problem of, look what wonderful work they've all done, without thinking about the trauma issues, the psychological issues, the gendered loss of face. I had one young Vietnamese woman stand up in class and read her story and the whole class and all of us were in tears. And I celebrated myself as a critical pedagogue that evening. She never came back to school.
Yeah, so trauma. We need to have trauma-informed pedagogy.
It was the radical critical educator losing a sense of the mental health and well-being of the people that you're charged with helping. So
and then this standpoint epistemology, if we haven't gone through the trauma, and then if we just say, oh, disclose your trauma to me.
Yeah, we haven't gone through the trauma. You're asking, this comes back very much to one of your earlier comments, Xiaoqing, that you're teaching and you're spreading this work, et cetera, but you aren't taking up the kind of mental health capacity issues,
exactly,
clientele as you go down, and you're so busy being critical that critical pedagogy and even
that's very selfish kind of critical.
It can be narcissistic.
Very self-centered, narcissistic.
That's what Carmen and Jennifer Gore were writing about in Feminism and Critical Pedagogies, is they were saying all this Freirean pedagogy is about the male critical pedagogue giving you the truth, transforming you, empowering you.
Yeah. That's why there's a lot of critique of the so-called.
It can be a super teacher trip.
Yeah.
So the point that I'm making, Phoebe, is you need to consider and weigh the ethical responsibilities of auditing people's stories and what you do with them. And that can become the whole thesis issue of the ethics and morality of gathering stories. And if you think about that, Canterbury Tales, Handmaiden's Tale, Homeric poems, we gather stories. That is one of Harari's. We gather metaphors and we gather narratives.
Yeah.
But what do we do with them?
Yeah.
Which archive do they go into?
This digital story or digital multimodal composing is a very hot, trendy terms, but we need to take inspiration from Allan's comment, and also take inspiration from Chung Hong's work, this trauma-informed care. Yeah. Because telling story is not automatically liberating. It depends. Sometimes it is.
Yes. Yeah,
But
maybe.
Go ahead, Phoebe.
Yeah, maybe because my topic is to tell storytelling about what they value in their life. That's why from my collection of 2 years of storytelling from my adult students so far, it's not about the story about how harsh they learn English or how harsh they migrate to a new place. It's nothing like this. For my collection, because the student can choose their own preferred topic, they are doing something very creative and valuable on their own. For example, one student tried to create a story reflecting on the journey that her mom delivered him. And then he used some baby photo, the way that her mom retold the process of delivery. And then he tried to reflect on the way that how this painful delivery experience affect the way that he values his family or something like that. So, and also another student tried to tell me a digital storytelling example that she loves Buddhism. That's why she loves visiting temples. That's why the whole story is about Buddhist idea, philosophy.
Right, Phoebe. Yes. Well taken. Your point. Yeah, some storytelling is liberating, and some. I mean, it depends. And so your students are telling you stories they like to tell you, which is good. Yeah.
And then, the core, it's in Bongji's work, it's in Angel's work, etc. The core that we ran into in schools is that the storytelling doesn't get you to expository knowledge and mastery. So we're actually dealing with a generic shift, with a genre shift.
That's right.
It doesn't occur organically or naturally.
Maybe remember we struggle with our academic writing, right? Yeah. So, but I'd like to respond to Sunny Lau. Hi, Sunny, in the YouTube audience. Sunny is asking a very, very important question to Allan. People now seem to live in parallel universes. They live in their own narratives. I mean, they live in their own stories about the world, about themselves, about other people. So what does it mean to still do work with critical literacy when we see people, the information, they live in different information bubbles. And they could also say that, oh, you guys live in your own information bubble. We live in our own information bubble. How can you say that your reality is more true than my reality? Now that we say everybody lives by our own narratives. So what does it mean to do critical literacy when we have this situation? Everybody lives by their own narratives. Everybody lives in their own narrative bubble, right?
Well, that's by definition, everybody lives in their own heads on some level and behind their own eyes. True. But I think key to it is to return to Stanley Fish's idea of interpretive communities. Is we don't live solely behind our eyes and in our own heads. We live in interpretive communities. These interpretive communities are just being redesigned by algorithms and AI and by social media now, and they're being redefined. So we live in, probably most of us, in multiple interpretive communities. But what I'd like to, the work of critical literacy, I think, I come back to almost a Luddite position on this. And by Luddite, I mean almost an anti-technological position. And I actually did prepare, I wrote one quote, and it's from Plato's Phaedrus. in which Socrates basically says, you go with this print stuff and you're going to lose the art of memory. People aren't going to know what's going on around them. You're going to lose song and poetry. And so what happens is with each communications medium shift, what we do is human beings get de-skilled in some ways, just like we've watched within 2 decades, we've watched the inability of people to do mental arithmetic with the advent of the pocket calculator, okay? Well, Harari's point, and I think Plato is the same as Plato's point, which is it's all well and good to jump into these new interpretive communities, but the skills that will be lost, particularly when the grid goes down, are actually quite vital skills. And so I think in that paper, in the last paper I did for Don Elverman that I sent to you all to look at, it concludes with a call for oral language. Schools and universities are among the last places where people are forced to talk to each other. And that's an accident, and it drives everybody nuts. Why would you want to go to a boring place where you have to sit and listen and hold your tongue and listen to other people in groups? Well, that's the very nature of civility. That's the very nature of society that Harari says is being lost and fragmented into multiple digital communities, interpretive communities. So I think the first thing that schools need to do is we need to begin rebuilding face-to-face spoken language communities at opportunity. And I mean, this was Jonathan Haidt's position. He said kids now grow up playing video games, digital, and they're on their tablets, and they're under surveillance of their parents all the time. How did we grow up? And Haidt's point is, we grew up in multi-age groups roving the streets in which no parent was there, in which the 11-year-old was telling you as a 6-year-old not to jump on that curve or you'd hurt yourself. Right. So the community, and if you had a beef with somebody, you couldn't resolve it or walk away. You had to deal with it face to face. They might hit you, they might smile at you, they might hug you. So the necessity of retaining spoken language and face-to-face interaction is something that schools and universities can actually return to and redouble. So in response to the question, the first question, Angel, that our way of dealing with the fragmentation of community is to rebuild social capital in face-to-face humane ways, okay? Rebuild communities capital. I mean, this is partly what J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and Robert Putnam's work on Bowling Alone was saying. The conservatives and the post-liberals don't have it all wrong. They're looking at fragmented narcissistic communities. In fact, they're led by a narcissist. Fragmented narcissist communities, and they're saying this all-in American individualism does not work when you actually need multi-generational, face-to-face communities, neighbors that talk to each other, and the rebuilding of social capital. Now, that's going to happen sooner or later. It's going to have to happen as we deal with planetary crisis, et cetera. But it's still there in indigenous communities. It's still there amongst certain generations, and it's still there in Okinawa. It's still there in a lot of places, and it needs to be fought for and retained. The second thing is, I'd say, how do we begin, is we return to close reading. We need to deal with AI through falsification. One of the basic problems with AI is falsification. We're already using it, and we just need to stop, slow down, have face-to-face discussions of text. The best thing that the new criticism taught me as an undergraduate was slow scholarship and slow reading. Remember when I said the first time I read Hegel, it didn't make any sense to me. I had to read every line, and then we would go over it with the professor almost sentence by sentence, and I'd say, what does this mean? What does this mean? As late as the 1980s and 90s, I would do this with graduate students. I did it in Singapore. Angel's done it with you as well. We'd go through Voloshinov's Marxism and the Philosophy of Language, and we'd go sentence by sentence.
Yes.
And
That's
people
why we have our study group every Monday morning. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it works. It slows you down. It gets you to probe. You can triangulate sources of information, etc. And what we've gone to, and this comes back to the earlier question, Chongan, about the impact of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism and digital scholarship is soundbite scholarship. I got zillions of citations. When I look at them, I can't imagine that they ever read the work.
No, they don't.
Nobody reads the work. What they do is
they might have read someone's work, like my work. I quoted you, and then they quoted you secondhand.
Or they take a quote out of context
Yes,
And
and out of
or they
context.
cite you as stating something that you never said. Okay,
Right,
so the
exactly.
degree of digital superficiality,
Digital superficiality, I like
nobody actually stops and reads.
Nobody really reads my work. They just cite my work. I would say stop citing my work without reading it first.
Yeah,
right?
because, and admittedly, Angel's work and my work, it isn't all that easy to read. You can find other people's work that's easier to read. It's dense, it goes off in directions, it's multidisciplinary, it's eccentric. So it's hard work to read the stuff. So the two things that I would say that we combat the fragmentation are, first of all, returning to the circle around the fire, where we tell stories and where we talk, and where we look at people's faces and gestures, and we're accountable and responsible for what we say. The second thing that we can do that quasi-digitally, but we need to do it face-to-face and with kids and with adults. The second thing that is a return to, so a return to close reading of print texts, close and slow reading of print texts, in which we're discussing, falsifying, arguing, disagreeing, and we begin to learn that and learn how to do that with civility.
With civility.
With civility. And we learned all of the interactional, conversational exchange rules, the turn-taking rules, etc., of learning how to live together again.
Allan, but that civility needs to be disrupted. Tsinghua could tell what happened to me the other day. Tsinghua, if you, because I don't get a speaking turn, and I have to disrupt that civility. Tsinghua, tell them what happened to me.
I think maybe you can tell that's, I mean, that's, when I tell it, I will have my interpretation, like I said last time. I think basically Dr. Lin was taken away her turn of sharing, contributing her perspective, including the ontology, because the other parties in the university do not even acknowledge the existence of an ontological difference, because they hold their epistemological, ontological stance as the hard truths of the reality of it. So, which leaves no space for even a discussion of ontology while they were carrying out a research collaboration. So it was very uncomfortable, unfortunate situation. So that Dr. Lin had to fight for her turn to talk in that situation. Yes.
Well, that's a very good rendition of it. It was traumatic. I have to say, it was traumatic. I don't want to do that. But fortunately, the ending is not that bad. How I got them to do a reading for Tsinghua, and I got their ears finally. They agreed to do a reading, phenomenology and critical narrative analysis. But of course, it is traumatic and it has emotional cost. I was in tears. And then the whole day I was so psychologically unsettled, because in our culture, Allan, you don't speak up for yourself, especially a Chinese woman, right? With all these males, right?
Angel, you and I spoke about this 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we discussed
I'm still doing this. You remember we were in that restaurant on Bonham Road near the Hong Kong U. It was 1996 in the Knowledge and Discourse Conference. You were a keynote speaker. And then I was presenting my PhD research and about the need to use students' mother tongue, students' familiar language in the classroom in teaching English. Then there was a native English teacher, a white male in Hong Kong.
I remember.
And then I was in tears. I was a fresh PhD in 1996. I was a fresh PhD from Toronto. And then I was in tears. And then you took me out to the restaurant near the University of Hong Kong. And then you told me something I still remember to this day. You say, Angel, your life trajectory is going to be difficult. You are female. You are a woman of color. And you are a so-called non-native speaker. And you are in a TESOL discipline. Your life is going to be doubly hard, triply hard, very, very hard, okay? I still remember it to this day, but your support to me has been so pivotal so that I can still live on in academia to this day. and help to build the next generation, so that they will carry on. They will carry on the torch.
Very good. Well, you see, I mean, you meant good that you mentioned where we're trained, the cultural background, because I had to learn how to lose my temper, because nothing in my upbringing, even though it was Chinese American, nothing in my upbringing gave me a disposition of anger, because anger was loss of face.
I was so angry the other day, just last week. Xinhua was witness to it. I was so angry I couldn't help myself. Yeah. And then you see, Xinhua tell the story. How I got my hand like this.
You hit your hand.
I hit my hand. I banged my head on the table in order to voice my anger, and I stood up to get my speaking turn.
And you know, the thing about it, and we should all be aware of this, is, okay, you can be the dean, you can be the director general, you can be, you can be in the highest position, the senior professor, etc., and you're still going to run into this. You're still going to run into this.
I'm still a woman. I'm still a woman of color. I'm still in a culture where the institution has males, and males dominate institutional culture.
Well, you see, the trick, and I think the trick across all of your careers is this, is it's not whether to fight, because you're going to fight. You're going to have to stand up for yourself at some juncture. It's when you fight and which battles you take on.
Exactly. Select your battles, and when you feel that you are secure enough. Yeah. And then, but I felt secure enough that these people are well-meaning. Right. They are not narcissists. Okay. Yeah. They are just well-meaning, but maybe unaware. Yeah. So
that's where
I'm aware. Yeah.
In 1976, I was finishing my teacher training at Simon Fraser, and Jonathan Kozol, the American radical who wrote "The Night is Dark and I Am Far from Home," came to teach a summer school course. So I went to Kozol's class, and he gave me my first copies of Freire. I had never read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and that immediately I thought, whoa. But then what Kozol said was, this was right in the middle of the Vietnam War, the protests and all of that. And he said, look, you don't want to be radical dumb. And I said, what's radical dumb? And he said, radical dumb is when you fight every fight as if it's the war. And I said, why? And he said, because, so the first time that you hear a racist comment in the staff room, you go crazy. You fight them. You call them out as a racist. And he says, what happens then is you might win that day, but you aren't going to be around very long to win the battle.
Exactly. We need to select the battles.
Yeah.
And we also need to conserve our emotion energy. Because something that is emotionally draining, I couldn't work the whole day, the rest of the day after that. Fighting is emotionally unsettling, very traumatic.
The difference between strategy and tactics. You have to have a grand strategy, and you can't tactically win every battle. You've got to somehow occasionally say, oh, there's a racist, sexist. I'm just going to walk away.
Exactly.
Because I have to save myself and keep my sanity and my power and my capital for when it really matters. And so what Kozol said is, he said, when you're fighting, when your students are on the line, their lives and their careers and their communities and families on the line, then you fight to the death.
Yeah.
When it's your ego that's on the line, then you have to be able to walk away.
And then sometimes you need to select your battles precisely because your students' careers are on the line, because you need to retain the social capital to protect your students, right? Yep. So I think I couldn't say how much we owed Allan, I mean myself personally, but the next generation of researchers, scholars. But we could summarize a little bit of what we have. The slow reading, slow scholarship, even though we are under neoliberalist pressure to publish. And also we assume that face-to-face, that social capital, that community, the sense of community, which is so lacking now. And also in the age of AI and in the age of social media fragmenting us, the algorithms, we need to try to join in different interpretive communities face-to-face. And we cannot afford to live in our own echo chamber. it's not easy, but we are trying, and our hope lies in you. I mean, the next generation of scholars in Chonghong, Bongyi, Qinghua, Phoebe, Tracy, Xiaoqing, Alfred, out there, Sunny, and all our YouTube audience out there. And I think I'm aware of the time. And before we end our live conversation, I'd like to have everybody say something to Allan. Okay, starting from Chunhong, you organized this, yes.
I just want to say I'm so grateful for this conversation with Allan, because when I studied my doctoral degree in SFU, I remember at the first class I had with Andrew, she introduced your concept of reflective trainer, and I still have this kind of positionality as reflective trainer in my research and in doing my studies, and I really appreciate this kind of scholarship you bring to us.
Trainer, Allan, remember in Singapore, in one of those meetings, you said we have to be in between disciplines, tweener.
Yes.
So I introduced Chonghong in his first class, which was, I forgot, 2020 or 2021. Yeah. They read the article where I say we have to be tweeners, and I took it from you, and I cited you. We have to be tweener, reflective tweeners, yeah. So thank you, Allan. Bungi?
Thank you so much again. And then Junho and Angel to putting all of us together, first of all. And then thank you so much, Allan Luke, for all your wisdom and the courage to reveal your story in such a eloquent and complex manner. And I was able to even visualize while you're talking about the historical development and then our field. My main takeaway is the complexity and complexity of the critical pedagogy and critical literacy and
critical work, yeah.
Yes.
Critical work. That it's not either or it's there's no right or wrong, but lots of self-reflexivity and encourage as well. But at the same time, I start to also notice that we start to move away from cognitively laden notion of what we mean by education or what we mean by literacy. But it's also in a way that we are somewhat moving to more affective domains, and we with care and develop relational ethics or relational accountability. So lots of thoughts, but it was so refreshing and enlightening to hear other people's work and as well as your insight. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bungi.
Thank you, Bungi. And remember, your emotional labor is important, even though it is so draining now. And as Allan said, no one can have your experience, and your experience is your advantage.
Yes.
Yeah. So you remember Allan's words. Whenever you feel I'm so tired, I'm so drained physically, emotionally, but I have to say to myself too, it is building up myself as a better person, as a better scholar, as a better researcher who can do better critical work, more grounded in the realities of our students, right? So you are being trained as a strong scholar through all these emotional difficulties, right? Bungi, I know you're under a lot of pressure, and just hang in there.
And a little chip on your shoulder.
Yes, yes, Bungi, yes.
I start to turn my attention to when there are situations where I see the students' face is not really unclear and in doubt and so forth, and then when I was starting my teaching, I start to, how come I blame my students? How come they don't know? But now I'm turning into how can I make it more accessible to them? So it becomes more not a linear kind of concept, but it becomes more recursive, revisiting and coming back, and it's through the interactions, the face work, the body movements that students make, and
Yes.
The affective dynamics, the body dynamics, the emotional dynamics. And what you're working on with Pedro is important, drawing on wisdom from the indigenous communities of Canada, working on relational ethics, really relational accountability. It's very important. You are doing very important pioneering work in our field, even though it feels lonely sometimes, but you are never lonely in our community.
Just one quick comment. The disembodiment of knowledge and the disembodiment of literacy is part of the problem here. Okay?
Yes. And that brings us to Xiaoqing. Remember this, we're working with Professor Paul Thibault, and he is precisely addressing this disembodiment of language theory, right? The whole discipline of linguistics is taking linguistics from human beings, from human bodies, taking it into an abstract vacuum, right? So I'd like Xiaoqing to say something to Allan. Unmute, yes.
So thank you so much, Professor Allan, because it's really a privilege for me to have this opportunities to learn and explore things from you, and especially in the first year of PhD. I mean, because your clarification and identifying, theorization of critical literacy elements, which really inspired my thinking. So one key takeaway is definitely the recognizing the fundamental role of face-to-face dialogue, which is also reinforced by our another theoretical scholar, the Professor Thibault. Also, we have this agreement that the face-to-face conversation really help us to reinforce and promoted the flow of languaging and communication. So, and also the speech as an essential ontological components of like all cultures and societies. And also, yeah, so thank you so much for having today's conversation, and it's a privilege to learn from all of our members.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Tracy?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Luke. I wanted to take this chance to express my gratitude to your work because you're so deep, profound, and then illuminating. I also like your work of the Phil Graham about the axiology. Yes. Yeah, the discourse analysis, and I also like how much you connect to Professor Thibault's autopoiesis theory of the languaging, and so it feels like all of the things are connecting to me. It all comes back to me so vividly, connecting, to the critical literacy theory back at Boise and now at U Hong Kong with Professor Thibault. Yes, thank you so much for your work. I really like them.
Well, you give my very best to Professor Thibault, because working on that paper and working through his paper, because you'll see in that edition, the key to Thibault's paper, to Paul's paper, is Hegel. And so for me, I was just working on that collection on Phil's, and suddenly this hit my table. And I was back when I was 19 reading Hegel again, and I got it. And Paul and I were on the same page with what he was trying to do. So that's very good. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. And Phoebe?
Yeah, thank you so much for today. I think what I learned from also Angel's work and also other peers research project will be how to be more humanized, but at the same time, stay being open-minded and critical. Because before getting trained at Hong Kong U, because I finished my part-time doctoral training at Hong Kong U, I studied literature at Chinese University of Hong Kong, and then our and teaching style would be quite different from what I gained from Hong Kong Youth Training in the Faculty of Education. Even if I study fictions and narratives in post-colonial context about Hong Kong, I didn't get into your theory or any framework about critical pedagogy or anything like what I'm learning now in my Faculty of Education training. So to me, I think it's a lot of puzzle moment, struggle, and sometimes I feel that getting further trained didn't really make me happier. That's my reflection after almost 10 years of teacher professional training. Because when I'm being more, more empowered by my own way of looking at things, because it can be a kind of naiveness to some people's perspective, but to me, I think I feel happier if I know limited way to look at things. That's what I felt when I was an undergraduate or my active study about literature, because I don't feel so stressed. But I don't know, a lot of critical framework, methodology, and finish my master and also doctoral training in education. I feel very burdened sometimes. Just even critical sometimes, if we use the wrong way to do it, we feel that we are always under criticism and then feel skeptical about things. Then as a teacher or as a student, I don't feel comfortable, to be honest, sometimes. So that's why I think I will keep learning to balance and liberate myself in a better way. And that's what I need to learn.
Phoebe, I am totally empathetic to what you're saying. Let me put it this way. The burden that we all take on as scholars, it's very much like having this cloud over your head in a cartoon, in that, and especially critical scholars, because you're always unpicking things, you're always deconstructing things. For me, that's why I stopped academic work so abruptly and left the university in my 60s. I just left. I haven't stepped onto the university campus in 12 years, pretty much. And the reason is I had to find my old narrative self. And I think that the joy that comes from writing and playing music and singing, and with others, sometimes without words, but the communication in my community with other band members and so has given me that back, given me a certain heart and spirit back and soul back. And it's given me the space to tell stories again. And it's given me the space. I was in a songwriters workshop with people from Georgia, and they were saying, how do you write political songs and this and et cetera? And I said, I write to my elders, my grandparents, I write to my parents, I write to my dear friends who are in strife, I write. So for me, turning away from the expository, because I had become a talking head expert, and learning how to sing and play and be joyous again was really, really important.
Be a human being with a body again.
and the trick to it is making things. Today I'm going to work on a stone wall, just working on sandstone with concrete. So it's just making things, whether it's stories or songs or working with wood, but making things. If you can keep doing that,
making things,
sewing, whatever it may be, dancing, whatever it may be, but if you can keep creating things, your expository work and your grammatical function ultimately will kind of go into that, will flow into it, will contribute to it. Because I find songwriting very similar to what I was doing academically, but on a totally different emotional level. And it's so the shift from exposition to narrative, and then what Indigenous people taught me is, you're just a talking head. You're just you need to be. Where's your soul? Where's your heart? Where's your love?
Where's your heart?
And you've got to go back to narrative to find that. Family narratives, others' narratives, your own narratives.
Songs, narratives, poetry, and then dancing, and then being in community, embodiment with other people.
I've got some other scholars like Bill Green who now say to me, I told you so, Al. I told you. It was always about the poetry. And so part of your heart has to do that, has to create things, and has to make things, and has to build your community of the people that you love and care for.
last but not least, Tsinghua. Tsinghua is very pivotal to this conversation because he's hosting the technological infrastructure for this Zoom meeting and this live stream interview. Yeah, Tsinghua.
Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Luke. Well, from your discussion just now, I think I've had some new thoughts about the recent puzzling experience. I volunteered to teach a student in Hong Kong who is labeled as behind students. I volunteered in the organization to teach the student for free. But, for quite a period of time, I feel that somehow I feel that he's not very much into it. He's not very much invested in learning. And as I label myself a critical scholar, I feel like I should have realized some of the reasons behind it much more quickly. But just now, I kind of feel that your sense of disembodiment, I feel like all the school stuff that I've been coaching him to do, the literacy, the grammar, the writing, is so detached from his everyday life. He had to work like 30 hours of McDonald's after high school work. And then I just feel like it's so distant from his everyday life. So that could be the reason why he's not invested in it, right? So this could be a starting point for any changes that I could try to do with him. So I'm not sure that if I can do it perfectly, but I think you helped. I mean, this live conversation helped me to realize it, helped me to connect all the critical theories that I think I'm getting familiar with the everyday life, the work and things that I'm doing in my life and in the student's life. And that's why I find this conversations today is very significant. It helps to make the connections, helped me to think beyond like the words and sentences I read in the book.
We've heard narrative is one answer.
Yes.
And the other thing that might help is diaries.
Right.
Keeping diaries, both yourself and your student, keeping diaries, notes to the self, those kind of things are ways of beginning to break that alienation and tap into and get some kind of buy-in and investment in the process.
Right. Yes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually, I should thank both Allan and all of our next generation scholars here. I mean, you are our hope. I mean, Allan and Angel cannot be with you forever and ever. Even though I wish Allan could be with us forever. And then you are the next generation, and you will have your own students, and your students will have their own students. And then I always tell this story from this Yu Gong Yi Shan. This that's Yu Gong Yi Shan, Yu Gong Yi Shan. And Bongki has heard the story, the silly man and and this big mountain in front of this silly man's house. So we just have to keep our hope in our next generation. You are the next generation, and you are the hope. You are the hope for change. But don't make it too burdensome on you, right? So just do it bit by bit, piece by piece, in community, and we are always with you. If not in embodiment, but in spirit. Even when we are gone, we will be with you. So thank you again, Allan, and then also thanks to the YouTube audience. We have lots of friends there listening to you. We have Pedro, we have Kelly Pio, we have Michio Sakamoto, we have Lynette Chung, we have Sally Cow, Sunny Now, we have Shaila Shams, we have Moklis, we have Alfred.
Moklis.
Yes, Moklis is tuning in all along this morning. And so we still have 22 people with us. So this is really good. And we hope to keep the conversation going. And we hope to visit you to have a warm hug of you, Allan. We have this embodied face-to-face interaction. We really need someone like you to keep our community going, to keep inspiring our next generation of scholars, researchers, educators. Thank you again.
Thank you, Angel. Thank you, everybody. Much appreciated.
Thank
Great.
you. And tune into our next TLTS research seminar. We will have more scholars coming in. Thank you. And hit the bell, hit the like of our YouTube channel. Thank you. And bye for now.
Very much, everybody.
Bye,
Thank you.
thank you.